and the church doesn't know how to respond. And we are responding and training churches, para-churches, leaders in the church communities, their members, on how to respond at different levels. And we have tons of cases to do that. Some of you might have seen this week, I'm sure Luda will speak about it, a preacher in Southgate.
Yeah.
And that's one of our cases. And that's a man that was 2017, was arrested as well and went to court. And the judge, we have 100% success rate with street preachers. Anytime they are arrested, they are released because the law protects them.
Yes.
But the police don't know what to do. And so the police need training. So they pick him up, by the time they called, they told him leave him. So they went to drop him somewhere. And they couldn't charge him. But it's gone viral now. And Roger will speak, but that's just one of many. From magistrate to policeman. So I want him today to come and he will show you different examples. Whether it's their schools or in individuals, Christians, and what they're struggling, how they're trying to respond to what we're facing right now. Whether it's free speech, whether it's homosexuality, how you as a church, maybe you need a statement, a policy on it. He's one of our experts in that. That's why I want him to do more of that today. I was going to talk to you about 3 things, but I'll leave that and fit it in when we have questions. I was going to talk to you about discerning the times, discipling the nation, and the wind of change. But I will use all those 3, I will slot it in when we come to question times and see how, because if you don't understand the times we're living in, it's hard for you to respond. You don't know what you're responding to. And then I believe that there's a wind of the Spirit blowing. And as it blows, it comes with a wind of change. But that wind of change for a purpose, and you need to know it. So I'll ask that while they get him ready, maybe for 5, 2-3 minutes, you want to use the restroom, and then Roger will come back. But please, not for long, maybe 2-3 minutes, just stretch your legs, and then he'll be ready for you. Professor.
Being a lawyer sometimes is like being in a bad marriage. The person across the table is usually just being mean and rude to you, and so speaking to a nice group, it's going to be a pleasure for me today. So I've been asked to address the question of issues facing Christians in the UK today. Let's start talking about what's gone wrong in this nation, because this used to be a godly nation. It used to be a nation that sent missionaries across the world. It's a nation that has given much to the world by way of the prayer book, wonderful hymns. Yet 60 years on from when Queen Elizabeth took the throne, things seem to be a lot different. And let me tell you what I'm talking about. So at the Christian Legal Center, we literally receive calls daily. Sometimes the phone is just ringing nonstop from Christians who feel affected by the culture. Whether they've lost their job, whether like in Southgate, they were arrested for street preaching, any number of issues. But one thing is clear, the culture has turned against Christianity. It has become intolerant to those of us who want to live out our faith. So the question is, why has culture come crashing down so fantastically in the last 60 years? You know, my hypothesis is that the floorboards have been rotten for a very long time and things have just finally come crashing through. So let's compare what England looked like when Queen Elizabeth took the throne to what it looks like now. Sorry about this, technical difficulties. Let's advance to the first slide. So in 1952, only 4.8% of babies were born outside of marriage. That figure is now 46.8%. In 1952, divorce was rare, affecting only 33,922 couples. In 2014, there were 119,000 divorces, a 600% increase in the number of divorces. And rather than trying to reclaim a healthy marriage culture, Lady Hale, the President of our Supreme Court, has suggested we need to make divorce easier obtained and based on no fault. Next slide, please. In 1967, when abortion was legalized, there were 21,400 abortions. In 2016, despite the cultural mainstreaming of contraception, there were 208,553 abortions, nearly 10 times the amount from 1967. And since the decriminalization of abortion in 1967, more than 9 million children have been aborted in this nation, making the mother's womb the most dangerous place to live for a young child. To put that in perspective, I'm of Slovak heritage. That number of 9 million, if you take Slovakia, Slovenia, and Luxembourg combined, the populations of those entire nations, that doesn't make 9 million. That's the numbers we're talking about. And to be honest, I was in Parliament on Wednesday debating the issue of extending abortion in Northern Ireland, the prohibition to liberalize it and make abortion easier to access. And the one thing I didn't hear from anyone on that panel was any acknowledgement that the unborn child has any worth whatsoever. That whole committee meeting was based on a very dubious Supreme Court decision which had no precedential value. And I mentioned Lady Hale a little bit earlier, who said we should make divorce easier to obtain and based on no fault. In that Supreme Court judgment, if you look at it, you can find it online, paragraph 7, she likens having an unwanted pregnancy to having a parasite. That is the president of the Supreme Court. This isn't an uneducated fringe person, this is the president of our Supreme Court. We have a UN committee telling Northern Ireland that being required to carry a pregnancy to term amounts to violence against women. They'd say it's even torture, using the legal definition. So that's where we've come as a nation. If we go to the next slide, family stability hasn't fared much better. According to the United Kingdom's Children and Family Court Advisory and Support Service, there has been a 150% increase in the number of children taken into state care since 2006. Part of that has to do with the breakdown in the family. Part of that has to do with government feeling that it takes on the parental role over you. And we see it more and more, sadly, in our cases of Christian concern. People are being punished just because they're raising their kids in a Christian household. Hard to believe, but it is a fact. When we deal with adoption cases, the fact that a couple is Christian is held against them because they have views that may be homophobic. That is a fact. Cases of gender confusion in children have reached the level of public health crisis. Between 2012 and 2013, there was a 50% increase in the number of children who were referred to gender dysphoria clinics. Between 2008 and 2013, that increase has been 150%, and no doubt, since those figures were taken, that number is probably 500 or 1,000% increase. There are lineups at Tavistock to get kids into the gender dysphoria clinics. Something has gone terribly wrong. So a threshold issue Christians are facing legally is that as the normalization of sin increases culturally, law becomes more and more hostile to the gospel and to those who follow it. Sadly, these issues and that hostility have also made their way into education, and we'll discuss this at the end of the program, and I think that's a terrible thing, because what the other side knows is if they can steal the hearts and minds of our children, they will have control of the next generation. So the legal concept of freedom of religion, for those of you who have studied human rights or law, we often talk about freedom of religion. It's become whittled down to freedom of worship. So a lot of people think, okay, that's not a problem. A few years ago when you were looking at the TV and you saw Barack Obama, he would never say freedom of religion, he would always say freedom of worship. And you wonder, well, what's going on there? And that language has spilled into the UK. Theresa May, she'll say freedom of worship, not freedom of religion. So what's wrong with freedom of worship? Well, this is what's wrong. Freedom of religion includes the ability to openly live out one's faith in the public square, whether it be at work, at university, in parenting, or in public discourse about social sensitive matters like homosexuality, like Islam. Whereas the worldview behind freedom of worship, the new in vogue term, is that Christianity should only be protected, and even then, only within certain limitations within the four walls of a church, but it has no place in the public square. So ideology is the problem. The UK has many laws. In fact, it has a lot of good laws protecting Christian exercise. Increasingly, however, the problem has been our judges, our politicians, who have no idea even the most basic element of what our faith means. They can't understand even why the cross can be a religious symbol. Remember that case a few years ago, where they told the flight attendant on British Airways that she couldn't wear a cross. Well, those cases continue to this day. We will have one breaking in the near future of a very similar case, even more egregious than that. And the hostility they've shown to these nurses and flight attendants who simply want to wear a small cross as a matter of their faith is shocking to me. Now, following the atrocities of World War II, there was a realization that power must be taken away from governments in order to avoid tyranny. So one of the fundamental principles that's been preserved in every human rights document since then, whether it be the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, the European Convention of Human Rights, the ICCPR, whatever the human rights document, even the EU Charter of Fundamental Rights, freedom of religion is protected. And it's always protected near the top because it's always been viewed as a fundamental right. Now, whereas in the 1950s and 1960s, when these documents were being drafted, people viewed Christianity with respect. If you went to church, it was respectful. You were a person to be respected. In 2019, if you are a family who goes to church, you are to be viewed with suspicion. There's got to be something wrong with you. You've got to be homophobic. You've got to be Islamophobic. You've got to have some kind of phobia to want to go to church. So while we can point to many antecedents as to why our culture has reached this point, what is clear, as it has always been clear in our human history, that the root cause is based in sin. So not unlike the Tower of Babel, we have come to a cultural idolatry of self. The false and fatal belief that we no longer need God because we ourselves are gods. This was one of the underlying principles behind the Enlightenment. We no longer need God because we have human reason. We've gone beyond this small idea that there's a God. We know better now. That's old-fashioned. We've got science and things like that. Which is funny if you go back to the Enlightenment times and look at what they've actually believed back then compared to what we know now. It's just the arrogance of human reason, the belief that we really are smarter than we are. Jeremy Bentham is a famous utilitarian philosopher, and he took the next natural progression in this line of thinking. He believed that our actions as humans should be gauged by what he called a philosophic calculus. That is, we must measure each of our actions and maximize the amount of pleasure we have and minimize the amount of pain. So any concept of the common good fell at the wayside at that point. It was all about, I need to do as much as I can for myself. So whether it be aborting children, dehumanizing the unborn child, whether it be destroying the concept of marriage and family, so that I can live out my own life of whatever sexual ideal or identity I want to live it as. Whatever it might be, we want unlimited choice without any responsibilities. And the humans played a role in that. Sadly, too, so is the church. So is the church, particularly the Church of England. I would point to them specifically in this nation. The church should never, ever capitulate to culture. Christ transcends culture. Christian love means far more than tolerance. Sometimes Christian love means flipping over tables of money changers in front of the temple. To answer the earlier question of why things seem to have gone so terribly in such a short time, the answer is, as I said earlier, the floorboards have been rotten for a long time, and it is now just coming crashing through. As a culture, we now care more about rights than our responsibilities. Perhaps the first time in our history that we've thought about that in that way. We've hijacked rights language to give free license to any number of sins. And people aren't ashamed, whether it be in front of Parliament, in front of a court, they will argue for their sins and their right to live out their sins unashamedly. And they will criticize us for trying to defend moral principles in the law. We have turned away from Christ and created a world made in our own sinful image, and we now worship that image through the law. So David Cross, in his upcoming book, highlights two statements showing just how far as a society we have strayed away from our Christian heritage. If we can advance to the next slide. So Lord Denning, in his address in 1952, Lord Denning, in an address in 1952, said the following: "It is, I suggest to you, a most significant thing that a judge could draw his principles of injustice from the Christian commandment of love. I do not know where else he could find them. The common law of England has been molded for centuries by judges who have been brought up in the Christian faith. Now compare that to Sir James Munby's address to the Law Society in 2013. Not that many years later, and the worldview has already changed. That worldview is now, and this is from one of the highest members of our courts, religion is no longer the business of judges. The court should not try to be guardians of morality, because there is no longer one definition of right and wrong in the wake of the sexual revolution. Judges should now take people as they find them. Beliefs about matters such as sex outside of marriage or homosexuality, held by the majority in the 1960s, are as distant to modern Britons as ancient civilizations such as Nineveh and Babylon." The sexual revolution and the legal issues associated with it are worth discussing, I believe. I think that it's very clear that what we're living out today are the poisonous fruits of the sexual revolution. Those being abortion, rampant divorce, the redefinition of marriage and family, mainstreaming of pornography, sexual orientation laws, the homosexual agenda, and rampant idolatry. At the end of the day, however, none of what happened in the 1960s is all that different than what happened in the book of Genesis, or the sexual sin that has been one of the hallmarks of our fallen history. We need look no further than Lot, Judah, Samson, David, Solomon, or King Herod, to name just a few biblical figures who were involved in sexual sin that had lasting consequences. Today we make a proverbial altar for sexual orientation, whereas in biblical times they literally worshipped sexual false idols and had temple prostitutes. The Roman philosopher Cicero, living before Christ, saw one of the main flaws of the human condition, and that is man's willingness to give away his salvation for comfort and distraction. And he said, I quote, "The evil was not in the bread and circuses per se, but in the willingness of the people to sell their rights as free men for full bellies and the excitement of the games, which would serve to distract them from the other human hungers which bread and circuses could never appease." So more than 2,000 years later from that statement, not much has changed at all. In fact, Christians by and large aren't standing up because they're afraid of losing their reputation, losing their job, or somehow being embarrassed in front of their friends. That is precisely what Cicero was talking about. So not surprisingly, despite all of that, despite that fatal condition, the cure has never changed. It is Jesus Christ, our Lord and Savior. That's what makes all of you here today so important. It is your calling to resist the cheap bread and circuses and to be the defenders of the truth. This is your Daniel moment. What the law prohibits and what the law encourages matters greatly. It is a reflection of the thing culture holds dear. Every law has a moral quality. There is not one single law on the books today that doesn't defend some kind of morality. I remember when I went to law school, they asked us, that was the first question they asked us in law school, name a single law that doesn't have a moral quality. And you can't. The only question is, which morality that law is defending. And I'll tell you what, it is no longer defending Christian morality. So let's look at the Equality Act for a little bit. I think rolling out of the Equality Act in 2010 has been muddled. It's been confused. I think it's entirely likely that Parliament had an agenda in making it so loosely worded, so there was no legal certainty or foreseeability for service providers, educators, or even churches to know how to act when these challenges came their way. Sadly, the end result has been that many Christian ethos-based entities will betray their own beliefs and ethos in order to avoid potential litigation. Others may find themselves invariably and sadly at the center of litigation, and the reality is that the courts have provided little or no guidance as to some of the fundamental issues facing all of us today when it comes to living out our faith in the public square, living out our faith when we provide services, refusing services based on conscience grounds. The law is getting better, but there's still a way to go. So before I get into the Equality Act, I'd like to take a little bit of time to talk about another fundamental issue, and that is the freedom to share your faith. Now, Pastor Ade mentioned the outrageous, absolutely outrageous incident in Southgate. Now that gentleman, Pastor Ade knows him personally, arrested, taken to the farthest end of the jurisdiction, left in the middle of nowhere, which is just unacceptable. He finds a way to a bus stop, gets on a bus and goes right back to Southgate and continues preaching. And the law can't do a thing about it, because he was in the right and we have that freedom. So, I think talking about freedom of speech is important because apart from God's grace, our first line of defense is our ability to share our faith, to evangelize, to talk about the gospel, whether it be to our neighbor, to our co-worker, to whoever it may be. That is one of the chief commandments. It's the Great Commission. It's a commission we're all bound by. Yet we've become so conditioned as a society to say that talking about certain things is somehow illegal. There's certain things that are so taboo. We can't talk about homosexuality. We can't talk about Islam. That we've become a group of people who have become self-censored. Because we've become conditioned that when anyone talks about those issues outside of a church, there are still some good churches who talk about it inside the church, but outside of those walls of the church, you talk about that, you'll be painted as a bigot, you'll be told that what you're saying is backwards, and you'll be told that what you're saying is illegal. Well, I'm here to tell you that that is absolutely not true. First, true Christian love. This is true Christian love. This isn't this watered down concept of tolerance that you hear about all the time here in the United Kingdom. True Christian love is not bigotry. It's the source of speaking biblical truths. And second, the law robustly protects your ability to speak the truth and even to offend others in doing so. So we all know, to the hopeless sinner, someone caught up in their sins, there is nothing more offensive than the gospel. Because it shines a bright light on all of the terrible things you've done in your life. Those things that no matter how bad you are, your conscience tells you, I am the sinner. On the flip side of that, once that same sinner accepts Jesus Christ into his heart, there's nothing more beautiful than that very same gospel that has saved him from his sin. So as a ministry dedicated to the promotion and to the defense of the gospel, the Christian Legal Center has increasingly been concerned with the implications for freedom of speech that have resulted from so-called hate speech laws. How many here have heard the term hate speech laws? You may not know the term, but you can guess what it means, that saying certain things that are hateful are illegal. So the question is, what are hate speech laws? That's an important question to ask. If these things that we're saying may or may not be illegal, what exactly is hate speech? The fact is, no one knows. No one knows. That's a large part of the problem. So, whenever I talk about hate speech, I always refer to the great philosopher Humpty Dumpty. The wise egg, that one. When I use the word, Humpty Dumpty said in a rather scornful tone, it means just what I choose it to mean, neither more nor less. The question is, said Alice, whether you can make words mean so many different things. The question is, said Humpty Dumpty, which is to be the master, that's all. Indeed, hate speech appears to mean just what people choose it to mean. neither more nor less. Now, a recent fact sheet produced by the European Court of Human Rights. The European Court of Human Rights is the highest human rights court in this land. So they should know what they're talking about, right? So they have said, in defining hate speech, that, and I quote, "There is no universally accepted definition of hate speech." In a previous fact sheet, they observed, and again I quote, and this is important, this is the highest court in Europe on issues of freedom of speech. The identification of expressions of hate speech is sometimes difficult because this kind of speech does not necessarily manifest itself through the expression of hatred or emotions. It can also be concealed in statements which at first glance may seem to be rational and normal. So according to the fact sheet from the highest court in Europe, intended to simplify and explain the law, hate speech is A, without definition, B, difficult to identify, and C, can sometimes appear to be rational and normal. Is this really something we want to criminalize? Now, despite the lack of definition, many well-meaning institutions and governments have attempted to identify particular speech which they consider to be criminal. Now, for example, the Fundamental Rights Agency, which is a group that I'm sure no one has heard of. I wish I hadn't heard of it. I served on their advisory panel for 2 years. It's one of the agencies of the European Union that is meant to defend our fundamental rights. It spends a lot of time doing quite the opposite, I have to tell you. It has defined hate speech, and this definition isn't terrible, but you'll see why I'm mentioning it in a minute. They say hate speech refers to the incitement and encouragement of hatred, discrimination, or hostility towards an individual that is motivated by prejudice against that person because of a particular characteristic. The problem is this. In another document, that same agency states that the term hate speech, as used in that section that they were delineating, includes a broader spectrum of verbal acts, including disrespectful public discourse. I mean, if we make disrespectful public discourse illegal, half of the committee people that I was before on Wednesday should be in jail, to be honest. It also admits that the data collected by the national monitoring bodies may not, strictly speaking, all fall under the definition of hate speech. Nevertheless, it says that the data collected in that section, despite the fact that it may not be hate speech, they title that section hate speech by public and religious figures. How dishonest is that? Honestly, how dishonest is that? So if it's to be accepted that there's no definition of hate speech, it's sure not helpful for the same organization to use different definitions in different documents and label some as hate speech and others as not hate speech, yet still labeling it as hate speech. That it kind of, to wrap your head around it is regrettably the confusion of terms abounds. So in a recent case before the European Court, that same European Court called Vedlund v. Sweden, which was a harder case. There's a saying that we use in law that bad facts make bad case law. And this is one of those cases. You had a group of skinheads in Sweden break into a school and place pamphlets speaking about homosexuality in the lockers of students. So the pamphlets themselves actually were quite factual. There was nothing entirely hateful about those pamphlets, but what you had was a group of skinheads who broke into a school, which is a big issue. So when this went before Europe, they didn't have criminal trespass. They didn't have any other element. All they had was hate speech. And the 7 judges sitting with the world watching, you aren't going to let these guys off the hook. So you got to do something and find some hook to get them by. And in that case, it was freedom of speech. So they threw freedom of speech under the bus because they wanted to punish these guys. So in that case, the European Court held that while the particular speech in question in that case, and I quote, did not directly recommend individuals to commit hateful acts, the comments were nevertheless serious and prejudicial allegations. The court further stated that attacks on persons can be committed by insulting, holding up to ridicule, or slandering specific groups of the population, and that speech used in an irresponsible manner may not be worthy of protection. Now the problem is, for decades,
For decades, the court has held that freedom of expression constitutes one of the essential foundations of a democratic society and one of the basic conditions for its progress and for the development of every man. It is time and time again held that freedom of religion includes the right to shock, offend, and disturb. So the right to share information that everyone agrees with is not a freedom at all. Why would that be a freedom if you can only say something that everyone agrees with? So the real freedom means the right to say things that might offend people, might be shocking to some people, might disturb people. And in fact, if you look at human history, every time we've made significant progress, whether it be, for example, with ending slavery, those were things that were shocking and offensive to people at the time. We've always made progress. The things that the street preachers say, the things that the great evangelists have said have been shocking. They've been offensive. Talking about damnation and hellfire, those are things that some of us don't want to hear. But we need to hear it. And that's how society progresses. And that's what the European Court has said time and time again. So here's the problem. I ask who here in this room would be confident in placing certain expressions in the protected category on the basis that there is a fundamental right to use speech which offends and shocks, and place other types of speech in the criminal category on the basis that that speech is serious and prejudicial. What is the difference between protected, offensive, and shocking speech on the one hand and criminal and serious, prejudicial speech on the other hand? And the answer is nobody knows. And Humpty Dumpty was right all along. The question is, which is to be the master? That's all. In other words, the groups, and we see them all through society, the campaigning groups today, that shout the loudest, get to define what is and what is not hate speech. And you know what? The groups that have been shouting the loudest in the last 10 or 15 years have been the homosexual agenda groups. They've been the Islamic groups. Whereas there's been a little squeak coming out of the church now and again. And that's why we are where we're at. So in other words, whichever group shouts the loudest gets to define what is not hate speech, and that is bad for fundamental freedoms, bad for the principles of legal certainty, and bad for rule of law. Legally speaking, fail, fail, fail. Examples abound in the United Kingdom. Examples abound, as Pastor Ade said, in the work of Christian Legal Center. Let's start with Barry Trahorn. I love Barry Trahorn. Barry's got a good heart. He's just an honest, God-fearing man who loves sharing the word. So Barry is an ordained Pentecostal minister who was pushed out of his job at a prison, literally for quoting 1 Corinthians 6 during a voluntary prison service. So you got a man here who's basically volunteering, not getting paid a whole lot, at a church, ordained Pentecostal minister, who during a voluntary prison service, no one had to be there, it was voluntary, does what? Quotes the Bible. Now, what's insane about this particular prison is that a large portion of that prison population are there for sexual offenses. So him preaching on sexual morality in a prison was deemed to be offensive. Now, the complaining prisoner who got Barry basically fired was someone who was in there for having sexually assaulted young boys on several occasions. The court took that gentleman's opinion over that of a Pentecostal minister about what should and shouldn't be appropriate to say in the prison ministry. How far astray have we gone when our courts are saying that we cannot preach sexual purity in a prison filled with sexual predators? Speaking of prison, one of our most active clients is a gentleman by the name of Mike Overt. Now, Mike's a street preacher. He's been arrested more times than most drug dealers, to be honest. Now, I admit, I'm using a little bit of hyperbole, just a little bit, because he's been arrested a lot. But what has he been guilty of? He's preached the word. Now, some of the things he's preached on are not things that a lot of us talk about in polite society. He talks a lot about sexual immorality. He talks a lot about homosexuality. He talks a lot about why Christianity is better than Islam, and that rubs a lot of people the wrong way. So while some may or may not agree with how he preaches it, the question is, and the most important factor about Mike's cases, are that no matter how egregious he's been, he has been acquitted 100% of the time. So that tells us that despite all of this gnashing of teeth and ripping of sackcloth when it comes to hate speech, we do have freedom. We have a lot of freedom. Only once has Mike ever been convicted at a lower level, at a magistrate's level, which was quickly overturned on appeal. And I mention that just to show you how anti-Christian some of our courts can be. Now, the prosecutor in that Bristol magistrate's case, I won't name his name because I don't want to name and shame, but he unashamedly told the court that just because the words were being preached from the Bible does not mean that in today's England that those words couldn't amount to hate speech and a hate crime. So we have officers of our court unashamedly arguing that Scripture can be hate speech. We have a lot of cases, too many cases, that's why I have bags under my eyes, where our clients have suffered immeasurably just for living out their faith. Richard Page, a man who's been before the courts now for a number of years defending his case, is a magistrate in the family division who was sacked. Why? For saying that a child is better with the mom and the dad. So this was during closed door session. An adoption case where there was two potential adoptive parents, a same-sex couple who he knew had a backstory. But that's never been made public, but he knew that that wasn't a good pair of people to put them in, and then a mother and a father family. And he simply expressed his belief as a Christian and as a magistrate, doing exactly what he was supposed to do, acting in the best interest of the child in question, that a child does better with a mom and a dad. Guess what? A child does do better with a mom and a dad. A few years ago, that wasn't uncontroversial. I've written articles, I've published articles where I brought together all the literature. It's no question, if you look at social science, psychiatry, if you look at the social indices about graduation rates, criminal rates, drug use rates, teen pregnancy rates, kids who grew up with a mom and a dad always do better. It's not saying that single parents can't be great parents. Can't say that other models growing up with an extended family isn't a way to grow up. It is just a fact, though, that the best form of a child for their growing up is with a mom and a dad in a low conflict relationship. You add going to church to that and praying together as a family, those numbers are through the roof. It makes me wonder, really makes me wonder, why society is being so hostile towards Christianity when the evidence there for the policy is so strongly in favor of supporting Christian households and living out their faith and living a biblical life. Now, Eunice and Owen Johns were forbidden from fostering children because of their views on homosexual behavior. The Equality Commission, which is it's a human rights commission that your taxpayer money goes to pay, filed a brief in that claim. I'll give you the backstory. First of all, they had been fostering for years, and they were doing short-term fostering. That meant that if there was a household where it was too hot, too much going on, say the parents were addicts or abusive, and the child needed to be removed for a short period while that situation calmed down, they would be short-term fosterers. They were providing an invaluable service. An invaluable service. When asked, they had been doing it for years as well, never a complaint. They had taken a break for a while, came back, reapplied, and the culture had changed by then. And they were asked, what would you do if the child self-identified as gay? And the father simply said, well, we talked to him about it. We share the gospel with him. And that was enough to say, you are homophobic. You will never foster again. Never foster again. And the Equality Commission, again, this wonderful human rights commission that your tax dollars pay for, filed a brief in that case. It said that the decision to not let families like the Johns adopt or foster was a good one, because it runs the risk of infecting children with Christianity. Infecting, as if it's some kind of disease to control the gospel. So the result of hate speech provisions is a reduction in the fundamental freedom of speech and freedom of expression. Instead of being free to disagree with one another and to have robust debate and a free exchange of ideas, hate speech laws shut down debate. They create a heckler's veto and a chilling effect on what we can and can't say. And I think each of us knows what I'm talking about. Each of us knows that when we talk about certain issues in certain company, we lower our voices because we don't want to offend, we don't want to be viewed as bigoted. And that's what hate speech laws have done. In a recent Fundamental Rights Agency publication, it's lamented that there currently is no adequate European Union binding instrument aimed at effectively countering expression of negative opinions. Is that really what we want? We want laws aimed at countering the expression of negative opinions? No one's allowed to share their opinion unless they, as part of the group thing? I think this is really a new type of inquisition. If you do not hold the views of the current cultural zeitgeist, you can be arrested at Southgate, you can be removed as a magistrate, you can be removed as a prison minister. This is a problem. There's no longer any freedom to be a Christian. And we need to reclaim our laws because we have good laws. Amen. We have bad judges, but we have good laws. Amen. Why do we have bad judges? Because we have bad culture. And churches are responsible for fixing that because no one else is going to do it. It begins in church, begins in your household, begins with you. So despite all of this political correctness, the good news is, as Mike Over's cases show you, you do have an unlimited right, nearly unlimited right, to preach the gospel. Amen. So please use your voices, because we need them. Amen. We need them. Amen. We need to be salt and light in a culture that no longer has salt and light. We need to kick at the darkness until it bleeds daylight. So let's move on now to the issue of sexual orientation and sexual orientation laws. So there's a document I think you should all be aware of. It's called the Yoga Carta Principles. Now it's a strange document because it has no legal binding force. It was a group of homosexual advocates who called themselves experts got together in Indonesia, drafted a Bill of Rights to what they think they deserved, kind of a wish list, and started saying that this is the new law of the land, and started sending it to Parliament and to the UN, and people started believing it. People started believing it. And it has even gained some level of legal force, not directly, but through the laws here in the United Kingdom. So the principle of sexual orientation is defined in the Yoga Carta Principles as each person's capacity for profound emotional, affectional, and sexual attraction to and intimate sexual relations with individuals of a different gender or the same gender or more than one gender. Now this definition of sexual orientation is dangerous because it equalizes all sexual relationships, divorcing sexuality from its biological purpose, which is having children, and it also tells us there is no social responsibility for our sexual acts. It doesn't draw the distinction, and this is a problem not just with that, but in the law in general, here in the UK and at the EU, between, on the one hand, discriminating against someone because of their sexual orientation, or having a moral opposition to homosexual behavior. The difference between loving the sinner, hating the sin. So the law in popular culture has wound that up into one and the same act. And it's really handicapped churches in a very serious way. So much so that because of this confusion of terms, any number of service providers, including churches, wedding cake bakers, florists, wedding photographers, anyone who's in the wedding business has been affected. And those cases, we've heard about them here in the United Kingdom with Asher's Baker. We've heard about them in the United States. They've been at the Supreme Court there as well. So I think there's several important principles here at play. So the reality is we oversimplify the arguments when we talk about rights of conscience. And the two arguments that they use all the time, and they're there on the screens, is first, that refusing, that anyone going into business should not be able to refuse providing a service to a prospective client on moral or other grounds. So you're in business, you've kind of lost your rights, you have to serve anyone based on any reason they want. That's just what people think the law says. And second, such a refusal is akin to racism or any similar act of prejudice, so that if someone who comes in and wants you to solemnize a same-sex marriage and you say no, that's as bad as being racist. It's the worst kind of prejudice. You're a hateful person, and you should never say no when someone asks you that, because everyone's equal love, you hear that everywhere. Those arguments are fallacious. They're wrong. And I'll tell you why. The first argument, it's important to remember that just because you go into business doesn't mean you check your human rights or your social rights or your legal rights at the door. You still enjoy those rights, whether you're a businessman or not. So this idea that just because you're in business, you have to do business with everyone is simply wrong, and it's silly, to be emphatic. Well, a customer certainly does have a legal right to obtain a service, but that has to be balanced against the rights of the business owner as well. That's an important thing to understand. So, to put this into perspective, I think even the most secular person in the world knows what guilt feels like. We all have a conscience. We know what it feels like when we go against the conscience. That is apologetics, the defense of Christianity in philosophical thoughts. That's one thing that the other side can't get across. They can't get beyond. They can't argue the fact that God hasn't placed the law in our hearts. Because even the most secular humanist, they feel guilty when they do something they've done wrong. So how did that guilt get there? So when someone goes against their conscience, we know what that feels like. And inevitably, once in our lifetime, hopefully not, but with a lot of people, they do something so terrible against their conscience that they feel that for the rest of their life. And that regret can be life-changing. So each of us holds certain internal feelings at the core of who we are. Those feelings could be, for example, love of country or love of one's children. So too, for the Christian service providers of the world, is their love of Jesus Christ and adherence to what they believe Christian sexual morality entails hold tremendous and life-changing value. For this reason, in our gut, we should know why it's wrong to compel a Christian service provider to violate his conscience. Now, literally, in each and every one of the cases I'm familiar with, it's always been the case of hating the sin, loving the sinner. In a lot of those cases, the same people who were denied a wedding cake or a wedding photographer, wedding pictures, had been served by those service providers in the past. So it was never an issue of, we don't want to serve you because you identify as gay. It's, we will serve you, but when it comes to solemnizing something we think is sinful, then that's where we draw the line. You can't compel us, and you shouldn't be allowed to compel us to commit sin. Because participation for a lot of people means complicity with. So this leads us to the second argument, that refusing services to someone in relation to promoting same-sex weddings or homosexual behavior in general is akin to a terrible prejudice like racism. And I think this is a red herring, and I think it's an easy one to deal with. We just need to look at two scenarios. So the first scenario is that of a person of color being refused services by a printer. Now our instinct is to impute a motivation of racism onto that person. We say, well, that's just idiotic in this day and age to refuse that service. So in our gut we say, you've got to provide the service. And that's been the argument for sexual orientation. How backwards are we to say no to a service like making a wedding cake for a same-sex marriage? So let's look at the second scenario though. Same scenario, same scenario with that same person of color. Same printer, but let's add that the printer in question is Jewish and the client is wanting him to publish virulently anti-Semitic literature. So now we've changed the scenario quite significantly. And I don't think anyone would say we need to force that Jewish printer to print that anti-Semitic literature, no matter what the color of the person asking that request. And take it one step further, even if that Jewish printer has never himself experienced anti-Semitism, it's bound up in the very existence of who he is in the human history of the Jewish people. Well, as Christians, we have that morality bound up in our very existence. And forcing us to provide services is not all that different in that case. So sexual orientation laws, unfortunately, they pervade every area of our lives, whether it be adoption laws, surrogacy, artificial procreation, all of these are affected. The rights of teachers, employees, service providers have been affected. We have a book stand here, manned by the great Andrew Boba. A lot of great materials there. A lot of great materials about a lot of what we're talking about here today, about knowing your rights, about knowing some of these issues. We encourage you. A lot of that stuff is free, some of it's for pay, but really some encouraging, wonderful material. So we encourage you on the break to go there and see what we have available. So for those who say that sexual orientation laws haven't changed culture, because I remember when they were legalizing same-sex marriage a few years ago, they said, don't worry, Christians, it's not going to affect your lives at all. You'll be able to do everything you did in the past. Well, ask Gary McFarland, Vicki Allen, or Felix Nagoli. Ask Svetlana Powell, Sarah Mabui, or Mike Davidson. Ask Jeff and Sue Green or Andrew McClintock, all clients of the Christian Legal Center, all who have had their lives drastically changed because of sexual orientation laws. Education has also been greatly affected, and it'll be much more so, in my opinion, as government rolls out mandatory sexual education in the coming weeks. We've got about 40 days before that becomes law, so we have a lot of work before us. Now, the belief that the Department of Education will act objectively and in the best interest of our children on this issue, I think is naive. It's been my experience. I've been doing this for 15 years. That when government is tasked with creating sexual education, bad things happen. The World Health Organization, we all know that. We know groups like UNICEF and the World Health Organization. They've got a UN stamp, so we say they got to be good. They got to be on the up and up. Now, the World Health Organization has developed sexual education guidelines for Germany and other parts of Western Europe. You know what they teach? They teach masturbation to 4-year-old kids. That's pedophilia. That's the United Nations. That's not a friend group, that's the United Nations. In Germany, I had defended 14 Christian parents in Salzkamp. This was a few years ago, cases before the European Court of Human Rights. These kids, 9 and 10 years old, were being forced to attend 2 days of mandatory sexual education. No opt-out, just like they want to propose here in the United Kingdom. Guess what they did to those 14 parents when they refused to put them in school? They sentenced them to jail for 40 days each. And each of them spent their time in jail. Martyrs for the cause, because they changed that law after them. But it took those parents going to jail for that law to change. Sometimes we have to stand up. In Belgium, they have this project for little kids. I don't want to get too. I've been on TV and stuff and debated this, and I think, okay, I need to expose these things because just saying they're wrong, people don't get it. But then I feel dirty even talking about it. And I'm an adult. I'm 44 years old, and this is being taught to little kids. So in Belgium, they have a project where they literally take gummy bears and they put them in provocative sexual positions, and the kids are to name the sexual positions. That's their homework. In Spain, their homework is they're told a number of sexual positions. Their homework is to name more positions. Now, how does that help kids? How does that help rebuild a family culture? How does that prevent teen pregnancy? I think if anything, it encourages broken families and responsibility. Now we have perhaps an implicit trust in our government because when we were kids, we had a different education. My education didn't have gummy bears or anything like that. Thank God. I can't even eat that. I can't even look a gummy bear in the eye anymore. We have to remember in this country, at the heart of education, there are campaigners at the Department of Education and at Ofsted. You know the head of Stonewall, are you familiar with Stonewall? Stonewall is the leading LGBT organization in this country. The former head of Stonewall is now one of the heads of Ofsted. No joke. Does he have kids? No. Does he have an agenda? Yes. I was at the Department of Education not too long ago for a meeting about sexual education and these issues where they were going to tell me how they're not ideological, how they don't want to promote homosexuality or alternative lifestyles. It's a beautiful building close to Parliament. You walk in, it's glass, it's these beautiful white walls. There's no symbols, there's no pictures anywhere in that main lobby, except there is a 2-floor rainbow flag. This is the ministry dedicated to educating our children. They're not ideological, but the only thing you see in their lobby is a giant rainbow flag. If you've ever got, now they've rolled out a new tagline on their signature lines. You know when you write an email and inside your signature, your title and all that? If you get an email now from someone at the Department of Education right now, that email signature line will have a rainbow on it which says, I am an LGBT plus champion. It has a little asterisk. It gives you a little teaching moment for those who receive the email, which says, we cannot tell by looking at someone or by their name how they self-identify their gender, and warning the reader to be sensitive as to use gender pronouns. That's the emails we're getting from our government. The government that is developing our sexual education right now, which they're telling us we shouldn't be worried about, and we're not going to let you opt out your kids from. We have a lot of work to do. Now, I want to tell you, just closing up my session, I want to talk about Izzy Montague. Izzy is a mother in Croydon. I don't know what they're drinking in the water in Croydon, but they're going crazy there at the schools. Because I've been getting calls every day from Croydon about, you wouldn't even believe what's going on in Croydon, but I'll just talk about Izzy because there's too many families to talk about. Izzy is Afro-Caribbean. She's a pharmacist, very intelligent lady, who moved with her husband from the middle of England to London because she wanted to be in the big city. The young couple, they thought it'd be exciting. Their 5-year-old son, they put him in school in Croydon. And all of a sudden, their son's being read books about same-sex parenting, little cartoon books about same-sex parenting. The school walls are plastered with pro-LGBT posters. And the head teacher decides, you know what would be great? You know what would be really great? Let's have a gay pride parade at our primary school. And let's tell any parent who doesn't want to take part that they have to take part because there's no right of opt-out. A gay pride parade at a primary school. And so Izzy, well, first of all, a lot of the parents weren't even aware that this was happening until it was too late. So the kids took part in it. The school later denied that it was a gay pride parade, but that denial is silly because if you Google that, there's plenty of evidence. There was an MP who took part there saying, wow, what a great gay pride parade. There was rainbow flags everywhere. That's not a pride parade. I don't know what a pride parade is. She complained, saying, look, you have a legal obligation to me as a parent, commensurate with the Human Rights Act, which says that schools must respect my right as a parent to raise my child as a Christian. You can't undermine that right in any way, and you have grossly violated that right by forcing my child to attend a gay pride parade, by reading them this material. So the head teacher, whose daughter works in the school as well, calls her in for a meeting. She says, okay, we'll hash this out. So Izzy shows up thinking, finally someone's going to take me seriously. Her daughter's there to take notes. It's a formal meeting. You know what t-shirt her daughter was wearing? That t-shirt said, if you're homophobic or transphobic, it's better just to be quiet.
Oh my.
Talk about disrespect. So Izzy went through the meeting. She was remarkably calm despite that show of aggression. And 2-3 weeks later, she gets a letter from the school, the outcome document of that meeting, which says, sorry, but we didn't do anything wrong. On that same day that that letter went out, the head teacher had her 5-year-old son put in detention for 3 hours. No one knows why. He's never been put in detention before. A lot of suspicious circumstances surrounding that detention. Next day, he gets put in detention again. She gets upset. Goes to the school, says, what's going on? She gets banned from the schoolyard. Now, we know of at least 3 other parents who suffered the same thing. They complained about the parade, child was put in detention, parent complained they were banned from the schoolyard. So this is education in the United Kingdom today. So we have a lot of praying to do, a lot of action. And I mean, Christian education, we need Christian education so badly. I've talked a lot about doom and gloom today, and I want to leave you with something positive. So I'll share something from Scripture with you. It's Deuteronomy 31:8. Do not be afraid, nor dismayed, for the Lord goes before us and prepares the way. So be courageous and be brave. You literally provide one of the final pillars against the sweeping tide of radical secularism and cultural relativism. This is the battle and the responsibility that will shape the next generation. It's been bestowed upon us. So let's be courageous, let's stand up, and let's fight. God is with us.
I'm going to show you some pictures, and after that, I'm going to bring Roger back and we're going to do some questions. Yes, but I want to see churches in Nigeria, but nobody is able to talk about it. As he said, my own son was almost a victim in his own school, where the caretaker rapes the boys. And they had to yank my son off of his hands and eventually put that caretaker in prison. That son was the grandson of one of the most prominent ministers in Nigeria. We produce, with Roger and all of us, many of us, a lot of these pamphlets, and they are free. Tons of them, there are a lot of them there. When you're ready, please make sure you pick them. We've taken time to produce them because they tell you what your rights are on a variety of issues. It educates you so that wherever you are, anybody challenges you, you are able to speak with authority. David Dean, somebody want David Dean, that black man from Canada who spoke on the video, and he spoke to the police and they couldn't touch him, they left him. And he went viral. It's one of our cases. Well educated, well informed about the law, when the police came to him, he quoted the things we gave him. Each one of them just backed off. Because he was speaking from a point of knowledge. That's why I've gone to Scotland Yard, I've gone to the police, we've prepared documents like this, freedom of speech. Every evangelist in the house or in your church must have this when they go and preach. Because the law, what protects them to preach, is in there. You must carry it with you. When the policeman begins to talk, you say, please, let me read to you what the law says. If you cannot remember it, read it. David was very intelligent. David was quoting it from his head. You don't have to quote from your head. Just let me read. This is the law. So I said to them, so if you are arresting me now, just know that you are also breaking the law. And they began to move back. And so, and the reason we spend so much money in producing a lot of this, man, this is just one of maybe 10 different topics on abortion, everything we have it there, is because my people perish. You know the one that is painful to me, God says, I reject you because there's something also called rejected knowledge. When people have spent money to give it to you free, and then you don't use it, and then you reject it, what is your excuse? For most of us in this room, apart from those in the 20s or maybe 30s, our mindset now is legacy. What can we leave for our children and our children's children? So that when their time comes, they will say, well done. Well done to us. That our parents did, they set us precedents. Case after case. This guy they called Oluwale that just did this case, it was a gift of God for this year. Tens of millions are watching this video everywhere. And when I called him and I saw his video and they were calling our office, I said, Oluwale, what have you done again? What have you done? He said, Pastor, don't mind them, that they are just making me popular. The man is a doctor, dentist. God called him to be an evangelist and he sacrificed his career. And he goes there unashamedly. That's what he does. And I said to him, Oluwale, you've been praying that God will let you as an evangelist preach globally. Now you are preaching globally. From Indonesia, from all over the world, they are calling us, they are calling him. They are thanking him, they are commending him. Now we have a petition out there. Some of you who are on our list, you've got that petition. Please sign it. Send it on your list. That's how we change things. People that will atheist, the lady that recorded him is Jew. She's with us as well. People who don't even know God are saying this is ridiculous. People of faith or no faith are joining on it now. So we quickly have to be quick. We were writing to the Home Office, the police need to be trained to stop disturbing us when we preach. I don't blame them. Let me be honest with you. Policemen, yes, but they are not lawyers. Except they are well educated on these things, they cannot function properly. I went to an assistant deputy commissioner of police who had to put his hand up and said to me, Ade, this section of the law that you just showed me, even I did not know it. Wow. And I respected him for that. At least he owned up. And he didn't know. I said, what I'm going to do is, I'm going to make sure this gets to every member of the beat. So they know. And it's true. But when we don't do anything, nothing will change. That petition is out now. We want it to be hundreds, if not millions. So that it gets the Home Office to do so. And we just didn't critique. We critique with a solution. We said to them, this is not right. However, this is the solution. This is what we can now do, and coming from the church to say, so that you save our time and you save taxpayers money. Some MPs are already borough commander of oath. The man, I'm sorry for him. Everybody is sending him letters asking for explanation. Then I must say this to you as well. And so we're taking up that, we're doing that. If you have got it, please sign the petition. If not, you will get some packs today as well, free packs. Sign up to receive our information, and you can go online and sign the petition and send it to other people. These are the things that we ought to have been doing. And we kept quiet. I always say that the voices in the city get loud because the voice from the church is mute. We cannot be silent anymore. The moment you are silent, remember your children and your children's children. When you kept silent, you are toying with their lives. I don't know if you can go to slide 43 or no, 49. I have a slide of almost 200 the pages, and if I begin to show you things, we have slept. We need to wake up. Oh, you know, let's forget this now. Let's move on. Come on, let's. It's one of the. He said dismantling marriage is his greatest achievement. Redefining marriage is the greatest achievement, and he's proud to export it to other countries. That's David Cameron. That's one of the greatest things I've done. Another nation has done. Want it. It's the public information. Let's go on. Let's go on. And she is following it through, and she's a son of a vicar. And she's a daughter of a vicar. Oh yeah. She voted against it. Now she says she regretted that she voted against it. Because what happened? They put pressure. When we don't put the pressure on them, somebody else will put the pressure on them. So I don't blame them. What are we doing? Next slide. Our own Arthur of Canterbury. This is what he said. He voted against it, then he spoke for it. You are either cold or what? What are you? Then he needs to be spewed out. He actually voted against it, and then he goes into the House of Lords. It's public information. It is clearly essential that stable and faithful same-sex relationships should, where those involved want it, be recognized and supported with as much dignity and the same legal effect as marriage. You go to their synod, the things they debate there, you will scream. They just had it last week, isn't it? One bishop had nothing to do. He's coming there and telling them you don't have to have service on Sundays. One of the bishops there. It's not his problem, it's not his fault. Whether there are 10 members in his church, he gets his pension. He gets his salary. That's why he's going to talk nonsense. That's why he hasn't got anything else to do. And he will go there with debating it as if it's a serious matter. Filled, creating liturgy for immorality in the church. Any nation is the reflection of the church within it or the lack of it. We are the picture, this nation is a picture of the church within it. And if you go to a nation where there's no church, you will see it as well. So go on, I just want to go through those pictures. That's the man he was talking about, the head of Stonewall. Go on. He's quoted somewhere to say that not every sex with children is sex abuse, is abuse. If you and I say it, what's going to happen? Okay, let's go on. That is synod. That is synod for you. Church of England. They have a group there called Changing Attitudes. That's what they promote. Right there, and they're allowed to put their thing there and promote it. Let's go. The moment they pass same-sex marriage, a lot of the Anglican ministers, you see them, they started marrying each other. They were forced to marry each other and put it on social media and everywhere. Now they are separated. They are split. Praise God. Let's move to the next one. They spoke to you about the schools. These are the books they used to teach our children in schools. I could have bought you the hard copies. I carry them with me. King and King. Heather has 2 mummies. Uncle Bobby's wedding. Jack and Jim. Asha's moms. And Tango makes 3. Let's keep going. These are the books in red. Dancing, jumping, music, pumping. Can you see them? Men and men in primary schools. Clad in leather, perfect weather. You see them? Keep going. Loving kisses, so delicious. See? Men and women. And then this one says, my princess boy loves his dad. Yes? You see gay pride? You see? Now look at the image here. Imagine us as a church. We want to parade. I am looking like this. And they can do it, and it's okay. That's what you're dealing with. And our children go, and our children do what? They see it. They even put it now in everything. They try to reflect it in adverts and all of that. So at times, no matter how much you try at home, your children are exposed to it outside. Oh, God help us. He already spoke about this. That's the lady. That's the man, the magistrate that he was speaking about, Richard Page. Pray for Richard because this whole battle for 2 years now has affected him. He's ill. One of the most successful NHS trusts that was failing, this was the man responsible for turning it into one of the most profitable. And after they dismissed him from being a magistrate because he said children do well with their father and mother, that same NHS trust struck him off. With all that he did. And I went to that meeting with him, I sat with them, I said, you will all regret it one day. What you've done to this man. Pray for Richard because he's taking his toll. A brilliant man. Fantastic man. Next slide. Islam. If I start on that, let's go. Let's go. Come on, let's go. Let's go. Because that one is another day. Let's keep going. Obviously, you know that we now have Sharia councils. Over 100 Sharia courts in this country. You don't know that anyway. Yes, over 100 Sharia councils we now have in this country. Now the country is trying to fight it back, but it's almost like too much too late. Now this one, all of you eat from these places. You want to go one step back? One slide back? Okay, go forward. You all eat in all these places. We as business are not being able to compel them to ensure that everything and the meat they use in these places is blessed in the name of Jesus Christ. But yet, all of them are halal compliant. Every single one of them have been forced to be halal. That's what Islam has done. The Bible says we should disciple the nations. And when you disciple the nations is not just people. It's people, institutions, and systems. People are the most important, but you must not lead the institution and system. If we Christians don't help disciple institution and system, somebody else will disciple them. That's what is happening with the education department. Islam, that's what Islam is doing here. It's going to every section of society and it's making sure they are discipling them. They are making them conform to Islam. Look at what, next one. You see them? So brown Allah. Have you saw it on the buses? Yes. You know what the meaning is? That's the meaning on the top. Allah is great. Bus advert. Most of you just see, you don't know the meaning of it. I don't blame them. We too should do the same. Thank God some of us are doing it. They are stepping into the space. What are we doing? Next one. They now have their own fashion show. Promoting modest dressing. And they are proud to do it. It's big time money. And even the fashion companies are beginning to design their clothes to look like theirs. But what happens to us who are Christians? Some of our churches are people come half naked to church. And then we'll be telling them that, oh, it's just their heart, leave them alone. And they are saying, no way. And they are leading the way. And we are meant to be disciples. Is that what the Bible says? Disciple the nations. Next one. Some of our churches now, I'm involved in this. Where I will see churches that want to sell their building, and I will offer a church to buy it. And they will say, no, they are going to sell it to mosque because the mosque gives them a little bit more money. I'm not telling you stories, what I deal with. It's painful. Slide, next one. This is the Water Forest. Until we went to Parliament to stop them. They printed this sticker and they were putting it on all over Water Forest, saying Water Forest has become a Sharia zone. And they put it all there saying you are entering a Sharia control zone. Islamic rules enforced. No alcohol, no what's that around there? Gambling, no parties and concerts, something like that. No prostitution and porn, and no drugs and whatever. Is there anything wrong with those things? No. Aren't we the ones supposed to be doing that? They didn't even get permission from the government. They printed it and they sent their people out and they were sticking it all over the forest. So we had to go to Parliament and argue and make noise, so they had to take it off. They are trying to disciple the entire borough. Just like they're already doing in some counties. What are we doing? Let's go on. Let's go on. Keep going. Keep going. Let me finish with this, because I want us to. I think it's slide 97. This is the Queen. The days when this country used to disciple the institutions. Even the royal family was discipled. Before the Queen was made Queen, she had to confess this. They had to make her confess God and confess that she will live by God's standard. That was when we were discipling the nation. And she had no choice, she had to say it. A gracious thing to keep your majesty ever mindful of the law and the gospel of God as the rule for the whole life. And government of Christian princes will present you with this book, the most valuable thing that the world affords. Amen. Let's keep going. The king, when they were going to war in this country, in 1939, he made sure that the best thing he could give to his soldiers was the gospel according to John. Not squad meters. Even though they had all of that, he said, the one thing that will make us win is the word of God. So he created the gospel, and in the first page of that gospel of John, look at what the king writes there. His Majesty the King, to all serving in my forces by sea or land, or in the air, and indeed to all my people engaged in the defense of the realm, I commend the reading of this book. For centuries, the Bible has been a wholesome and strengthening influence in our national life. And it behoves us in these momentous days to turn with renewed faith to this divine source of comfort and inspiration. Amen. Try giving that to our soldiers as they go this time. That was when we were discipling the nation. The next slide. The borough of Mountain. The borough of Mountain. This was one of our financial consultants. You know Chris Green? Yes, that was one of his elderly guy now. Then when he went to every child in that borough, when you enter the school, you are given a Bible. You don't care what your background is, you must have a Bible. And it was that Bible that he read and he gave his life. In the first page of the Bible, the borough of Mountain, look at what they write in the first page. The Mountain Education Committee presents you with this book, the most valuable thing the world affords, desiring that you use it while at school and retain it when you leave. Herein is wisdom which will lead you into all truth, provide comfort and guidance, and teach you the whole duty of man. Signed by the principal. That's why their generation was different. And nobody could question it. BBC, let me finish with that. Even the broadcasting corporation, when they were going to set it up and commission it, they had to bring the church to come and pray for prayer. And they put the statue there. It's there till tomorrow. Is the statue of the sower. And underneath it, there was an inscription. Next slide. This is the interpretation of the inscription that was underneath the sower. And they said, this temple of the Ark and Moses is dedicated to Almighty God by the first governor in the year of our Lord 1931. And his name is mentioned there. And they pray that good seed sown may bring forth good harvest, and that all things foul or hostile to peace may be banished thence, and that the people clinging their ear to whatsoever things are lovely and honest, whatever things are of good report, may tread the path of virtue and wisdom. They were trying to say that whatever is going to be broadcasted must edify. Yes. Must be in line with Christian what? Values. Look at what's going on BBC today. Far from it. Yes. My friends, the land is barren. The water is bad. And when they went to Elijah, he said, give me salt. And he went to the source and he poured salt there. And it flowed from the source. And everything was clean. Now let me say this to you. In our own generation, we are the people they are looking for. Romans 8:19 says, for creation waits with what? Eagerness. For the sons of God and children, daughters of God will what? Now, and it says we are the salt of the, and what? Light of the. So, in his own time, he had to go and look for what? The salt. And he had to go and look for what? The vessel. And then put the salt in the vessel and went to pour it in the source. In our own time, we are the salt. We have this treasure in earthen vessels. We are also what? The vessel. Now, we need to go and find where the source of this nation's problem is. And are you willing to pour yourself into that problem? To be the Daniel of your generation. To be the Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego of your generation. To be the Esther for such a time as this. It will require us to pour ourselves into this situation that we are here. Hallelujah. To look for the shot and say, if I perish, like Esther says, I perish. You are going to find something wonderful to live for. When are you going to find something worth dying for? You're trying to protect your reputation. You have no reputation. The kind of change you are looking for will take sacrifice. It will take more than what we are doing right now. We are playing church. I beg you in the name of God. It's difficult, but it's not impossible. But the Lord says, I will build my church. Higher, and the gates of hell. Let me tell you, no matter how bad the situation is, I am confident that God will overcome. My challenge to every one of us is that, will you play your own part? I pray that God does not look you over. Because God will do what he will do. But is it with you or without you? Because this generation is giving you an opportunity. And saying, are you going to do? Otherwise, I will go to the next one. I want to take questions, but I want to take an offering. And I don't need music for the offering. But I want to hear the sound of what you give. And I'm telling you, it's not because it's my brother. He doesn't ask anything for this. He doesn't, nothing. We just do this. In the midst of all our business, because we care for you. And we care for the people you care for. Yeah. And the Bible says, iron sharpens iron. And we must build each other up. But I want to ask you that as they take that bowl round, give something substantial. He won't tell you. They came here, this very place. They came to this church where he's doing all this great work. And they were going to shut them down. Am I lying? This, in this place, look at what they are doing with all the people that benefit and sleep on this floor. A silly boy from the council comes and tells him they're going to shut them down. The day he called me and said it to me, I was vexed in my spirit. I felt like Elijah. I felt like something should tear somebody away. But you see, we fight with wisdom.
Yes.
When he said it, they didn't know our capacity. By the time we finished with them, when they came here like this. we sat down, come. Before they came, I told them, are you mad? Don't you know we are dealing with? We came with lawyer times lawyer plus lawyer equals lawyer and everything. But before we came, I sent them a letter. So they came already with apology. They didn't want us to talk. No talk. He said, we are sorry. Any money we cost you, we will refund it. Just promise that you will not press charges. The same thing. With all this beautiful work, but that's what the enemy does. When he sees you're doing good things, he wants to shake you up. That's why I'm pleading with you. Please, to stretch your legs and everything, and after that we go to questions.
Pastor,
Come on, give, yeah.
Can we have the account number on this?
Put the account as well. Some of them have millions. They want to transfer it. This one is not big enough for their money. Yeah? So please, stretch your legs. Let's make a contribution, and after that we have questions. Even if you can only stay 10-15 minutes for the questions, believe me, you won't regret it.